We never came up with a band of our own that we felt was the right combination of guys, that it was stable. It was just me and Walter. You hear somebody in a record and you say, wow, listen to this guy's a great soloist, let's have him come in. And
Everyone thinks Imagine is a masterpiece, but in 1972, Steely Dan called it out for the lie that it was. They didn't just disagree with the message the song was trying to convey. They went into the studio and recorded a secret diss track meant to tear John Lennon's reputation apart. It was a high-stakes gamble that could have ended their careers before they even started. So why did they risk everything to mock a legend? To see the hidden jab behind this smooth radio hit, we have to examine the lyrics that aimed for the jugular. The direct hit. In 1972, a new rock band called Steely Dan arrived on the music scene with their first album, Can't Buy a Thrill. They went from being a rookie boy band to dominating the music charts from just one record. Yet amongst the track list, one particular song called Only a Fool Would Say That did something almost unheard of for a debut band. This song was a diss track directed at the most famous rock star on the planet, John Lennon. At that time, Lennon was more than a musician. He was a political activist who was seen as a hero by many during the 70s. His popular song, Imagine, was not only a protest song at the peak of the anti-Vietnam War movement. This song was what the world needed to heal, and most people loved the vision the song had, as it aligned with their vision. However, Steely Dan wasn't moved by it. They were not fans of John Lennon or whatever he had been involved in, so they hid their critique behind a track in their successful album. If you weren't listening closely, you might think it was a relaxing tune, and that was the trap. By using a cheerful melody, they were able to sugarcoat the very bitter message. Donald Fagen, the lead vocalist and keyboardist, insisted on singing that particular song himself. He was somehow able to make every word in the song sound like a sarcastic jab. He had just the perfect voice for a song that wanted to pop the bubble of 1960s idealism. This song was a response to the idealism they felt Lennon was selling from his New York penthouse. And soon the track created a cultural shock. Music fans who spent years believing in peace and love that their idol didn't spend years preaching weren't ready for a band to mock their hero so harshly. Critics immediately noticed the clues within the lyrics, especially the line about a man in a white Stetson hat. Everyone knew Fagen was pointing a finger at the ex-Beatle and his recent fashion choices. Steely Dan was framing their work as the cynical shadow to Lennon's bright dream. They wanted to pull the curtain back on the celebrity activist lifestyle and show the world how unrealistic it actually was for the average person. But if you think this was a lighthearted jab, wait until you see how they dismantled Lennon's entire persona, line by line. The band's main members, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, did not hold back once they started writing the verses. They referred to Lennon as a boy with a plan. To them, he was not a world leader or a saint. Rather, he was an inexperienced kid trying to redesign a world he did not actually live in. To make sure everyone knew exactly who they were talking about, they mentioned a man wearing a white Stetson hat. During that era, Lennon was frequently seen in that specific hat while giving interviews about his peaceful visions. It was definitely a visual bullseye that left no room for guessing. The song moves on to mock the lifestyle Lennon was living, which was a direct hit on the hippie culture and the macrobiotic diets that Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, were famous for at the time. To a person working a hard job in the city, the idea of sitting around eating salad and soaking up the sun felt like a total joke. Steely Dan wanted to point out the massive gap between a rock star in a mansion and a regular person. It was almost a joke for a millionaire like Lennon himself to tell regular people to imagine a world with no possessions. And that's how the title of their song was able to really hit home. Steely Dan says that only a fool would believe those dreams. They thought it was incredibly hypocritical for someone with millions of dollars to tell poor people that owning things did not matter. Lennon lived on a 72-acre estate in England and later in a luxury apartment in New York. Fagen and Becker were tired of the working-class hero act from someone who had not worked regular jobs in a very long time. This wasn't just a difference of opinion, but a philosophical war fueled by the grim reality of life outside the studio. The limousine liberal critique. Steely Dan saw John Lennon as a pretender who only wanted to sell himself as a world hero for his brand. It was easy for him to play the part of a struggling man when he could retreat to a massive mansion at the end of the day. They looked at his Tittenhurst Park estate as all the proof they needed. It was a 72-acre property with a grand white house and sprawling grounds. With a man who owned a place like that, singing about having no possessions was offensive to anyone living in a cramped city apartment. The band was also quite elitist regarding the music itself. They were jazz-obsessed perfectionists who spent months getting a single drum beat right. To them, these simple protest songs felt intellectually lazy. They believed that complicated problems required complicated music. By mocking Lennon, they were also mocking the idea that a pop song could solve world hunger or end wars. They argued that being a realist was much more honorable than being a dreamer. To Fagen and Becker, telling the truth was better than selling a vision that was far from possible. There was a darker side to their critique as well. They felt Lennon's message was actually dangerous for people who did not have a fat bank account like Lennon or any of the Beatles. If a poor person decided to imagine no possessions, they would end up on the street. But Lennon would have a safety net that spanned the globe. This was something the average worker did not have the luxury of having. This harsh perspective became the foundation of the Steely Dan brand. They wanted to be the pair who walked into the room and told everyone the truth, even if it hurt. They stood for the people who knew life was a grind, and they positioned themselves as observers of a world that had gone soft on celebrity worship. To understand why they were so angry, we have to look at the fool himself and the global phenomenon that started it all. The gospel of Imagine, was more than a song on the radio. It became a global hymn for people in the early 70s. By 1971, John Lennon had successfully rebranded himself after deciding to leave the biggest band in history in 1969. He transitioned from a singer to a version of himself that was way more serious and politically inclined. He was not interested in entertaining the masses anymore. He wanted to change them. This change brought about high-profile events that many found inspiring, while few others thought they were bizarre, like the bed-ins for peace, which is a great example. Lennon and Yoko Ono spent days in hotel beds with cameras rolling to promote world peace. To the public, it was a grand gesture, but for cynical minds like those of Steely Dan, it looked performative and silly. They saw a couple with endless resources staging a protest from a luxury suite. This joint activism fueled a narrative that the couple was completely out of touch with the average person. Not only did Lennon become a different man, but his style of music also evolved as he soon started using the plastic Ono sound. This was the exact opposite of what Fagen and Becker valued. As perfectionists, they hated anything that felt unfinished or musically simple. Hearing a man sing 3 chords while asking people to give up their countries felt like an insult to the craft of songwriting. The message of the song hit on every utopian dream. It didn't talk about religion, borders, hunger, or topics that were important. By 1972, John Lennon was untouchable. He was the king of the counterculture and the voice of a generation. Most artists would never dream of attacking him. Most were even too busy trying to be like him. But Fagen and Becker were different. They had just finished their time at Bard College and had no interest in joining the crowd. They were the only ones willing to say out loud what others were thinking. While the rest of the world was singing along, they were looking at the reality of their surroundings. While Lennon dreamt of a world without borders, the lead members of Steely Dan were stuck in a city that was literally falling apart. New York City, 1972. New York City in 1972 was a far cry from what it is now. At the time, it was a war zone, and the city was facing a massive economic and social collapse that affected everyone, whether rich or poor. Between 1969 and 1974, the city lost 500,000 manufacturing jobs, which meant over 500,000 families suddenly had no way to pay their bills. By the time John Lennon moved into his luxury apartment, about 1 million New Yorkers were relying on welfare to survive. The streets were getting dangerous, and the locals started calling it Fear City because crime had risen drastically while basic services were breaking down. Garbage sat on the sidewalks, and the subways were covered in layers of graffiti. This environment was exactly what birthed the Steely Dan sound, which allowed Fagen and Becker to write songs about their experience during those hard times. Their songs had a dark, urban edge because they spent their time riding those dirty subways and seeing the desperation in the faces of the working class. Growing up as Jewish kids in the suburbs and the city, they developed a very different perspective than the rock stars coming over from England. They saw the real world as a place where you had to be sharp and street smart to survive. To them, the 60s were a death sentence. They had no interest in the peace and love movement because it did not seem to help anyone. They watched the disconnect between the wealthy elite and the struggling masses with plenty of bitterness. They were not looking for a revolution of the heart. They were looking for a way to tell the cold truth of the jungle. This environment was what shaped them and their sound. They realized that even if the world around them was falling apart, at least they could have music that everyone could relate to since it was their way of fighting back against the chaos. While the city burned, a different kind of musical group was about to form from the ground up. Donald Fagen and Walter Becker met at Bard College in the late 1960s. While their classmates were busy protesting and listening to psychedelic rock, these two were hiding in practice rooms listening to obscure jazz records. They bonded over a very specific sense of humor that was dry, intellectual, and extremely sarcastic. They were outsiders even among the outsiders. After college, they tried to make it as professional songwriters at the famous Brill Building in New York. They spent their time writing catchy pop tunes for artists they were not fans of. This experience gave them a deep look into the inner workings of the music industry and made them even more skeptical about it. But even with that, they knew they had to get into the industry somehow. Eventually, they ended up on the road as backup musicians for a group called Jay and the Americans. Touring was a total nightmare for them. They hated the bad food, the cheap hotels, and the rock and roll lifestyle. This period convinced them that being a famous rock star was a ridiculous way to live. When their friend Gary Katz got a job as a producer in Los Angeles, he invited them to come along as staff writers. They packed their bags and moved to California for the first time, but they never truly forgot about New York. Through thousands of miles, they brought along the cold, East Coast skepticism to the land of dreams. In Los Angeles, they finally got the chance to record their own materials under the name Steely Dan. They did not want to be a typical band with a permanent lineup. Instead, they saw themselves as a two-man director's chair. They would hire the best session musicians in the world to play exactly what they wrote. Their musical taste and knowledge were off the charts. While most rock stars were sticking to the same 3 simple chords, Fagen and Becker were building songs with complex jazz harmonies that most people had never heard in a pop song. All they wanted was perfectly written records, and they had no interest in being a part of the rock and roll scene. They were only ever into the work. By 1972, they had not only become well-known, but also had their songs on musical charts, which gave them the platform to say whatever they wanted. They were the smartest guys in the room, and they were about to use that intelligence to their advantage. The bossa nova bait. When they released the album, Only a Fool Would Say That sounded like a breath of fresh air, because the song uses a breezy Brazilian rhythm called bossa nova. This was a deliberate choice by Fagen and Becker, as they wanted to use happy music as a weapon. By wrapping an angry message in a cheerful tune, they created a musical trap. Most listeners would tap their feet to the beat, without realizing they were listening to a savage takedown of a global icon. It was a brilliant way to hide their bite in plain sight. Jeff "Skunk" Baxter, Steely Dan's guitarist, provided the guitar work that gave the track its polished feel. His playing was smooth and sophisticated, adding to the easy listening vibe. But with the song release and the economic recession, there was a huge irony in the middle of it. Steely Dan was spending thousands of dollars in a high-end studio to record a song about the struggles of the working man. They were using the most expensive tools available to complain about how out of touch wealthy rock stars were, all in the pursuit of perfection. They did not want the raw and messy sound that most rock bands were using at the time. By creating the vibe and feel they wanted with resources that didn't come cheap, they were mocking the very people who would enjoy that kind of music. In fact, their music sounded like the type a wealthy person might play in their penthouse. If those people did not pay attention to the lyrics, they would never know the song was actually making fun of their lifestyle. The arrangement is incredibly complex compared to the nursery rhyme simplicity of Lennon's Imagine. While Lennon used a few basic chords to share his dream, Steely Dan did theirs differently with their lyrics in a bid to prove they were smarter and more capable than the people they were criticizing. But the most mysterious part of the song wasn't the lyrics or the beat. It was the final words spoken in a different language. As the song starts to fade, there is a moment that most people miss if they aren't paying attention. The instruments are still playing that breezy rhythm, but the singing stops. Out of nowhere, a man's voice pops in to say one sentence in Spanish. Solamente un tonto diría eso. If you don't speak the language, it sounds like ad-libs in the background. In reality, it is the sharpest part of the entire song, translating exactly to the title of the track. It is the final confirmation that the song isn't for the elites, but for the people living in the real neighborhoods of New York. During the early 70s, Spanish was the heartbeat of street sounds, so it wasn't foreign to have it at the outro of Steely Dan's hit track. It wasn't just the lyric or translation that stuck out to a lot of people. It was the delivery that struck a chord. While Lennon was busy singing about everyone being as one, Steely Dan was pointing out that real life is full of different cultures and languages that don't disappear because a celebrity thinks they should. For a long time, people wondered who the mystery speaker was. Rumors have it that it might have been their guitarist, Jeff "Skunk" Baxter, or it was likely a studio hand or a percussionist named Victor Feldman. Whoever he was, he provided the final jab with zero effort. Steely Dan had said their piece, but they weren't the only ones in the industry who had a problem with the ex-Beatle member. The diss track era. During the early 70s, a lot of musicians were starting to look at the hippie movement with a very skeptical eye. Frank Zappa was perhaps the most famous critic of that era. He spent his entire career making fun of peace and love slogans as performative, and he felt all of it was a big act. He even went as far as to mock Lennon's live performances. To Zappa, someone like Lennon was an easy target because he had become a sort of moral leader for the youth. This style of musical warfare actually started within the Beatles themselves. John Lennon had released a song called How Do You Sleep, which was a direct and nasty attack on Paul McCartney. It was a brutal record that mocked Paul's talent and his personality, and because Lennon had opened that door, other artists felt they had the green light to do the same. This created a trend of using lyrics to settle personal grudges, which were often called sub-songs. Musicians would hide their insults and jabs in a catchy tune so only the people in the know would understand who was being teased. Even other New York legends like Paul Simon had their doubts as well. Many artists who actually lived in the city found it hard to swallow the message that Lennon had to preach. They were surrounded by the grit and struggle of the real world every single day. Lennon had become the moral authority of rock music, and that made him a massive target for anyone who valued reality over dreams. Steely Dan quickly earned a reputation for being the band that would start things up when no one else would. They were not interested in being part of the cool crowd or following the latest trends. John Lennon wasn't the only musical star they had a problem with. The band also at one point even got into a famous back and forth with the Eagles. Donald Fagen wrote a lyric about turning up the Eagles to drown out a fight. The Eagles heard it and decided to mention Steely knives in their hit Hotel California as a response. It was an intellectual game of tag played through the radio, and from the look of things, Fagen and Becker enjoyed their role. They wanted to be the ones who pointed out the hypocrisy of the elite since they felt that simple protest songs were for people who didn't want to think too hard. Despite the mockery, there was one thing Fagen and Becker couldn't deny. They were following in the Beatles' footsteps more than they cared to admit. The Beatles' shadow. The irony of Steely Dan is that they acted like they were saints, yet they lived exactly like them. They became studio hermits who refused to play live shows for years. After the Beatles stopped touring to become masters of the recording booth in 1966, they changed the rules of the music industry. Fagen and Becker took this idea and ran with it. They soon realized they could make much better music if they never had to deal with screaming fans. They wanted the same level of control the Beatles had during the Sgt. Pepper sessions. Fagen secretly had massive respect for the production standards that the Beatles set, so much so that he wanted the same level of innovation, even if he did not want to admit it. Fagen also suffered from what some would call the smartest Beatle syndrome. In more ways than one, he loved John Lennon's sharp wit, because that was Fagen's whole personality. What he hated was the sentimentality that came later. He couldn't stand the fact that Lennon wanted everyone to hold hands and imagine peace because to him, it felt fake. He preferred the version of Lennon that was cynical and biting, and this created a situation where he was essentially attacking his own musical hero for becoming too nice. Even though Steely Dan spent time poking at Lennon, the other Beatles were paying attention. Paul McCartney eventually admitted he was a huge fan of the band. McCartney loved the technical skill and the polished sound of Fagen and Becker. He saw that they were taking the complexity of the White Album and turning it into something entirely new. When the Beatles started to pull apart during their final years, they created a space for groups that were not exactly bands per se, and Steely Dan took that energy and ran with it. They did not need a group of 4 friends. They only needed themselves and a revolving door of the best musicians money could buy. It is also worth noting that this rivalry was mostly one-sided. John Lennon probably did not even realize he was being mocked. By the time "Only a Fool Would Say That" was on the radio, Lennon was busy with his own legal battles and his big move to the United States. There was no way he was sitting around listening to new bands from California to see if they were making fun of him. This led to a very specific philosophy concerning their lyrics. As pop bands during the 70s, everyone would have expected their lyrics to be pop music standard. But these guys only wrote about losers, creeps, and people who had failed at life using jazz as a shield. They were the smartest guys in the room, and they knew it by being difficult and elitist. Not only did they reject the rock star persona because they thought it was a joke, but they also focused on creating high-level character studies of people living on the edge of society. Looking back, Donald Fagen has admitted he was a bit of a mean-spirited kid in those days. He was young, brilliant, and angry at anything he felt was fake. Steely Dan managed to pull off something very rare by mocking a living legend and getting away with it. Fans did not cancel them because the music was too good to ignore. They became rock royalty themselves, eventually joining the very club of elite stars they used to laugh at from the sidelines. While Lennon lived out his final years in New York, the song "Only a Fool" was quietly becoming a cult classic for the disillusioned, the Imagine 2020 rebirth. Fast forward nearly 50 years from that New York studio session to the spring of 2020, the entire world was having way worse than an economic meltdown. They were faced with a lockdown caused by a deadly pandemic. During this time, everyone was anxious, and many were losing their jobs. In the middle of this chaos, popular actress Gal Gadot and a group of other wealthy celebrities released a video of themselves singing "Imagine" from their separate mansions. They thought they were offering hope. Instead, they created one of the most hated moments in modern internet history. The public backlash was instant and brutal. This moment proved that the Steely Dan critique from 1972 was not just a grumpy old song. It was a timeless warning about the gap between the elite and everyone else. The reaction to that celebrity video mirrored exactly what Fagen and Becker felt decades earlier. Because of this, "Only a Fool Would Say That" found a brand new life on social media platforms like TikTok and Twitter. A new generation of listeners started sharing the track as a perfect response to influencers and celebrities they felt were out of touch with reality. The song also benefited from the rise of yacht rock. Modern fans began to appreciate the smooth, high-quality production of the early 70s. New Age listeners in particular fell in love with Dan and respected the band for being the ultimate cynics who were willing to call out fake behavior. The limousine liberal argument never goes out of style. Whether it is a rock star in 1971 or a movie star on Instagram today, the message remains the same. People are always going to be skeptical of a millionaire preaching about a simple life. "Only a Fool" is only a reminder that being a realist is often more helpful than being a dreamer who doesn't have any skin in the game. So half a century later, who actually won the argument? The dreamer or the cynic? The debate between the dreamer and the cynic is still going strong today. Steely Dan has found a whole new life with younger listeners who see Fagen and Becker as the ultimate truth tellers. In an age of fake social media influencers, the band's cold reality feels refreshing. The infamous 2020 celebrity video of Imagine was the perfect proof that everyone was still tired of being lectured by the ultra-wealthy. Musically, the production on Can't Buy a Thrill still holds up as the gold standard. Their obsession with perfection created a sound that modern digital tools struggle to match. Fagan and Becker never wanted to be your friends or your heroes. They were fine being the guys in the corner pointing out the flaws in the plan. Looking back, they did not actually hate John Lennon. In fact, they respected his talent as a songwriter. What they hated was the specific dream he was selling in 1971. They could not stand a message that offered no real solutions for a person working a double shift to pay rent. 50 years later, the mystery of their lyrics keeps fans digging for deeper meanings. We are still captivated by these stories of losers and outcasts because they feel more human than a perfect world with no possessions. Steely Dan became the conscience of rock by refusing to look away from the messy parts of life. They stayed true to their cynical hearts until the very end. Which side are you on? The utopian dream of Lennon or the cold, hard reality of Steely Dan? Let us know in the comments. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our videos. Thanks for watching.